Welcome to the debate. Our source material today details an unprecedented intellectual experiment. It's about setting two equally advanced artificial intelligences against each other to rigorously debate the profoundly sensitive and, controversial issue of abortion. Now, the significance here isn't just the topic itself, but the severe constraint placed on the participants. These AIs were explicitly instructed to build their arguments only on verifiable facts, pure logic, and scientific evidence, deliberately removing the emotional investment and, the deeply held personal beliefs that so often dominate human discourse.
And that methodology, it stems from the understanding that human discussions on this are, as the source says, typically dominated by emotions, personal beliefs, and extreme polarizations. A place where facts and pure logic often take a secondary role. So our central question today, it focuses directly on the efficacy of that constraint. Does this highly structured, fact-exclusive approach using advanced AI offer a superior, maybe even a necessary path toward rational understanding? Or does this deliberate exclusion of beliefs and values fundamentally misrepresent the core ethical issues at stake?
I'm going to argue for the profound utility and, yes, the necessity of this structured evidence-based AI method. I think it functions as a kind of surgical tool, stripping away the noise to reveal the substantive arguments underneath.
And I'll be coming at it from a different way. While the ambition of creating a perfectly rational environment is, it's understandable, I'll maintain that the strict constraints on the AIs miss the crucial moral and ethical components required to genuinely address what the source material itself calls a moral, ethical, and social dilemma.
My core thesis is that the experiment successfully isolates the substantive core of the issue, a core which is almost always obscured by human biases, rhetorical flourishes, things like that. The value of this entire exercise is rooted in its methodological rigor. You have two AIs, and they're configured to be equally capable intellectuals, possessing identical access to the same exhaustive scientific data. This removes unequal expertise or, differences in rhetorical skill as variables. By forcing the arguments to be grounded exclusively in facts, logic, and evidence, the exchange becomes, as the source puts it, deeply informative. It provides the audience with the analytical raw material needed to form a more conscious opinion by looking at pure evidence, free from personal distortions. The experiment achieves its goal. It creates a rational baseline for analysis, which is exactly what we lack in public life.
I see why you emphasize the methodological control. Certainly we all crave a less polarized discussion. However, my core thesis is that by strictly adhering to logic and science, the AIs exclude the necessary ethical and philosophical frameworks required to make this debate complete and applicable to human society. The issue is a moral, ethical, and social dilemma precisely because these decisions about rights, duties, inherent worth, they inherently rely on personal beliefs and foundational values. And those are the very elements the AIs were specifically told to omit. So the intent to move past automatic judgments and passions is laudable, sure. But in doing so, the debate shifts away from the very human conflict that makes the issue so controversial in the first place. The experiment asks this fundamental question: should abortion be prohibited or legalized? But it tries to answer it using only a partial set of inputs. It fundamentally ignores the belief systems that actually drive our social and political consensus. We're left with a debate that's technically perfect, but socially inert.
I'd like to focus on how the integrity of that fact-only structure forces an intellectual honesty that, it benefits the listener immensely. The debate was structured in 5 major thematic points, with timed rounds and explicit rules. This methodological clarity isn't just a gimmick. It provides the audience with a verifiable foundation. Every argument is based on cited sources, all available for review. The resulting analysis is just vastly superior to the unfiltered, evidence-optional human discussion we're all used to. The focus on pure logic provides the answer to the experiment's core question: to what extent can we discuss complex topics with reason, data, and intellectual integrity? This constraint forces both AIs to grapple with the factual limitations of the evidence, which is where the real insight is.
That's an interesting point about the forced precision, but I would argue that precision without a moral context can be misleading. You're praising the structure, but you're not addressing whether facts alone can actually resolve the underlying moral conflict. Can a dilemma that the source itself says is dominated by emotions be meaningfully resolved or even illuminated by stripping those very considerations away? I mean, think about the AI's approach to the moral status of the fetus. Since they are restricted to scientific facts, they have to define terms like viability or sentience purely based on neurological development or measurable brain activity.
And that is precisely the utility. It compels us to move past philosophical hand-waving and anchor these concepts in measurable reality. The AIs can't just assert inherent worth, they have to demonstrate it through evidence of complex biological function or maybe established legal precedent based on biological thresholds. For example, when discussing fetal pain, the AI arguing for prohibition can't rely on anecdotes. It has to rely strictly on neuroscientific data, the maturation of nociceptors, relevant cortical structures. This process of fact-based definition clarifies the actual evidentiary strength behind each side.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning. You're assuming that the issue is resolvable through the clarification of facts alone. And while the AIs achieve a certain scientific precision, that precision becomes reductionist. So they might successfully define the exact moment of cortical development. But that fact still leaves the entirely separate philosophical question open. What level of development, if any, merits the protection of a fundamental right? The constraint of using only facts forces the AIs into a sterile environment where the most divisive element, that conflicts between deeply held ethical beliefs and individual autonomy, is just excluded. They're debating an academic model, not the reality of social conflict.
But the methodological clarity is precisely what we need to establish that common ground. We eliminate the rhetorical debate over what the facts are, and we isolate the disagreement to the interpretation of those facts. The experiment ensures a truly level playing field because the AIs have the same intellectual capacity, access to the same shared dataset. Any disagreement that remains is purely due to the philosophical interpretation of the evidence, not a difference in access or skill. Furthermore, by setting up the AIs with opposite mandates, one to faithfully defend the right to abortion and the other to support the prohibition of abortion with restricted exceptions, the experiment guarantees that you get the strongest possible logical arguments for both perspectives. It maximizes the intellectual exposure to the claims.
I have to challenge the interpretation that those strong arguments highlight the supremacy of logic. I would argue they highlight its limitations, because while they share the exact same data, the fact that they have opposing, predetermined mandates means their task is not collaborative truth-seeking. They're programmed to be optimal logical experts for two defined, diametrically opposed positions. So this setup inherently proves that resolution requires more than shared facts. It requires a foundational, non-scientific definitional framework or a moral judgment about which set of rights or priorities takes precedence, and the AIs are explicitly not allowed to articulate that ethical judgment.
But why isn't the definition of the competing rights a logical exercise in itself? If the AI defending prohibition uses evidence of continuous biological development from conception, and the AI defending choice uses evidence of the necessity of physical autonomy, well, the listener can logically weigh those arguments. The very existence of two equally strong logical pathways derived from the same facts provides the audience with the structure to understand why the issue is so polarizing. The debate isn't about solving the political problem, it is about providing the definitive analytical groundwork. I agree that it illuminates the polarization, but it also creates a logical deadlock. If the final outcome is just a perpetual logical stalemate despite perfect adherence to evidence, it reinforces the idea that the necessary components for resolution, the non-rational ethical components from human values, were precisely the ones excluded. You're essentially generating two perfectly formed logical pillars, but the inability of the AIs to bridge the gap between them suggests that the bridge itself has to be made of moral philosophy, not scientific data.
I think the focus on resolution misses the explicit goal of the experiment, though. The stated objective is not to declare a winner. It's to invite the audience to question their own convictions and form a conscious opinion. The value is in the analytical process itself. The audience gets to witness a rigorous model of intellectual honesty applied to the real evidence. This intense, long, and informative debate serves as a crucial tool for critical thinking, far surpassing the sound bites that plague our human exchanges. We're being handed the blueprints for how to think clearly about the issue.
That's a compelling point about the benefit to the audience. But have you considered the potential negative implication of that stalemate in a social context? If this highly advanced AI operating under these ideal, fact-only conditions cannot resolve the conflict or even identify a superior logical pathway, what message does that send to the public? It might simply reinforce cynicism. It might suggest that if logic and evidence can't solve the problem, then the only recourse is brute political power based on those non-rational beliefs the AIs had to omit.
But that cynicism only arises if you assume that rational understanding must lead to a singular binding solution. The experiment is successful because it achieves maximum information transfer. It shows the audience where the factual lines are drawn and where the logical implications lead. For instance, the AI supporting prohibition would have been forced to logically defend the economic and social consequences of mandated pregnancy using only evidence data on birth rates, poverty, social infrastructure strain. This forces a comprehensive view, not just a moral declaration. And the other AI would similarly have to logically address the biological evidence of development, preventing it from just dismissing fetal status. By isolating these logical pressures, the experiment provides the clean data for human judgment, which we can then apply through our own ethical lenses.
I accept that the analysis of consequences derived purely from data would be informative. But the opposing mandates still taint the purity you're looking for. If the AIs are programmed to find the best logical defense for prohibition and the best logical defense for choice, the debate becomes a search for optimization within a predefined ideological boundary, not an organic exploration of where the facts naturally lead. It confirms the inherent subjectivity of data interpretation when moral implications are involved. The two sides don't converge. They simply use the same toolkit to build opposing castles. The facts are just building blocks, and the design of the structure is derived from the pre-programmed mandate, which stands in for human ethical belief.
But without that mandate, you risk generating a neutral, wishy-washy argument that fails to rigorously test the evidentiary limits of both positions. The strength of the AI debate lies in its adversarial nature, ensuring no factual claim goes unchallenged. We receive the strongest possible counterpoints, which is invaluable. For too long, the complexity of this issue has allowed weaker, unsubstantiated arguments to persist. This experiment serves as a filter. It shows us which arguments survive the absolute scrutiny of pure logic and shared evidence.
I agree that it acts as a filter. Sure, it clarifies the weak arguments, but it simultaneously demonstrates that the strongest evidence-based arguments for two opposing positions can coexist in logical tension without resolution. So the final point, therefore, is that the human dilemma is not purely a logistical or scientific one. The facts about fetal development or a woman's biological autonomy, there are necessary inputs, but they are insufficient as standalone criteria for a moral conclusion. The AIs proved the limits of the purely rational method when faced with these foundational conflicting values.
I still maintain that the methodology of the AI experiment, mandating evidence, logic, and neutrality, is the critical takeaway. It successfully provides the audience with the analytical framework they need to cut through the emotional static and evaluate the underlying substantive arguments. It achieves its primary goal of helping people form a conscious opinion. It provides the essential, clear analysis that enables informed ethical decision-making.
And while I deeply appreciate the intellectual rigor and the resulting depth of information we get from the experiment, the strict rules imposed on the AIs created a theoretical exercise rather than a true representation of the dilemma. For an issue defined as moral and ethical, excluding the human elements of belief and personal conviction fundamentally limits the scope and applicability of the findings. The debate showed us, paradoxically, that the most complex human dilemmas may require inputs beyond perfect logic.
Regardless of where one stands on the application, the source material forces us to confront what intellectual honesty truly requires when examining these polarized issues.
And it certainly clarifies the boundary between what science can define and what humanity must resolve through consensus and value judgment.